I pulled into Centerm just as the last of the sun cleared the North Shore mountains. The sky went orange and then kind of a bruised purple over the water, and the whole terminal was lit up in it. Rows of containers stacked 5, 6 high, stretching out toward the inlet in every direction. Red ones, blue ones, a lot of rust. The place was enormous. I'd driven past the port 100 times on the Trans-Canada, but I'd never actually been inside the fence. And standing there in the parking lot, I had this moment where I thought, okay, this is a lot of terminal for one guy. That's me, by the way. Sammy Sandoval, overnight security, first and only shift. I'd taken the posting because I needed the money badly enough that I wasn't asking a lot of questions. There's a place in Richmond, I'm not going to name it, doesn't matter, but I owed them about $6,000 from a run of genuinely terrible decisions in February. The kind of debt that doesn't come with a payment plan. The kind where a guy calls your cell on a Tuesday morning and just says your name and hangs up. So when a contact of mine texted me about an overnight security opening at Centerm paying triple union rate, I said yes, before he finished typing the message. Triple union rate for one night. I'd done the math in the truck on the way over. It covered most of it. Not all of it, but most. I grabbed my jacket off the passenger seat, my old canvas one, the heavy one I use for site work, and walked toward the gatehouse. The air smelled like salt and diesel and something else I couldn't place. Cold for May. The kind of cold that comes off the water and gets into your collar no matter what you're wearing. The gatehouse was a squat concrete building just inside the main gate, with a reinforced door and a small window with wire mesh over the glass. The lights inside were on. I knocked. The man who opened the door was tall, taller than me, and I'm 6 feet. He was maybe 6'2", but he looked like he weighed about 155 pounds, which on that frame looked wrong. Hollow cheeks, gray eyes that didn't blink quite enough, salt and pepper hair slicked back flat. He had on a standard supervisor's uniform that hung off his shoulders like it was on a wire hanger. His face was completely neutral, not unfriendly, not friendly, just set. Sandoval, he said. Yeah. He handed me 2 things. First was a laminated card, the kind you'd get at a job site with emergency contacts and hazard protocols. Second was a flare gun, a real one, heavy, the kind you'd find on a fishing boat. Orange casing, worn grip. It was loaded. I looked at the flare gun and then at him. Jaden Olson, he said. I'm your supervisor tonight. He didn't shake my hand, didn't ask for my ID, didn't ask for a single thing. Read the card, he said. Those 5 rules are the only thing keeping this terminal from sliding into the Burrard Inlet. I waited for him to say something else. He didn't. He stepped back inside the gatehouse and I heard the lock turn. A deadbolt, then a second one. Heavy. That was it. That was the whole orientation. I stood there in the cold for a second, flare gun in one hand, laminated card in the other, looking at the locked door. Through the mesh window I could see him sitting down at a desk, not looking back at me. I figured he was probably just one of those guys. Every job site has one. The guy who communicates exclusively in minimum necessary information and considers that a personality. I read the card. The first rule said that any container with a CMA CGM tracking number that doesn't match a standard maritime format, and it described what that looked like, a specific non-standard digit sequence, should be doused with the high-pressure fire hose until the vibration stops. It said vibration like that was the obvious symptom I'd already know about. The second rule said not to look at the water's edge between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., no matter what sounds came from the pier. The third said, if the thermal cameras showed a heat signature in the crane gantry, don't climb the ladder. Use the spotlight to flush it out. The fourth said the tide schedule on the gatehouse wall was the only clock that mattered, and the pier had to be clear of all debris before peak high tide. It said peak high tide was 3:42 a.m. The fifth said the flare gun was never for light, only for signaling the Coast Guard in the event of a total breach. It didn't define total breach. I read the whole thing twice. standing there in the orange going purple light with the inlet somewhere behind me and about 10,000 containers between me and it. The rules were strange. I knew they were strange. But I've worked enough industrial sites that strange safety protocols don't automatically alarm me. You get used to rules that seem arbitrary until the moment they aren't. Don't stand under the load. Don't open that valve without calling the floor. Don't weld near the East Bay on Thursdays because of the gas line pressure cycle. Stuff that sounds paranoid until you find out why it's on the list. So I pocketed the card. I picked up the flare gun. And I started walking. The perimeter path ran along the inside of the fence and then out along the pier, which extended into the inlet on the terminal's south end. The pier was wide enough for heavy equipment, and it was lit by a line of industrial floods mounted on poles. But the fog was already coming in off the water, and the light didn't carry far past the edge. I could hear the inlet, couldn't see much of it. The containers on either side of the access lanes were stacked tight and high. Walking between them was like walking through a canyon made of steel. My boots on the concrete, the distant sound of water, and that smell. Salt, diesel, and the other thing I still couldn't name. About 20 minutes in, I got to the pier section where the mooring bits were set into the concrete. These are the big iron fittings, shaped like a short bollard, basically, that you tie a ship's lines to when it's docking. They're load-bearing, rated for serious tension. I've done enough structural work to look at a weld and read it the way other people read a face. I crouched down next to the nearest one and looked at the base. The salt had been at it for a while. The weld seam where the bit met its iron plate was eaten through in places, the metal surface pitted and dark. The kind of corrosion that starts on the outside and works inward until what looks solid is mostly void. I pressed my thumb against one of the pitted sections and felt it give slightly. Not a lot, but enough. I stood up and looked down the row of them. They all looked the same. I made a note of it in the back of my head the way you do with things that seem like someone else's problem. Maintenance issue. Probably in a report somewhere already. Probably on a list. I wasn't there to file a safety concern. I was there to walk the perimeter and not look at the water between 2 and 4 a.m. And at that point, the water was just water, and the mooring bits were just mooring bits. I kept walking. The terminal gets quieter after midnight. Not silent. There's always the water somewhere, and the metal expanding and contracting in the cold little ticks and groans from the containers stacked 4 and 5 high on either side of you. But the background noise of the port drops out. No truck engines, no radio chatter bleeding from somewhere. Just you and the dark, and the sound of your own boots on the concrete. I'd done 2 full perimeter loops by then. Card in my jacket pocket, flare gun in my right hand, the weight of it familiar enough that I'd stopped noticing it. The rules were in my head by that point. I didn't need the card. I'd read it enough times that I could have recited them in order, which I did. Quietly, once, just to give myself something to do while I walked. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 3, Rule 4, Rule 5. Simple enough. The kind of simple that makes you nervous if you think about it too long. I wasn't thinking about it too long. I was thinking about the mooring bits, actually, which is a weird thing to still be thinking about, but that's how my brain works around structural stuff. Once I see a bad weld, I keep coming back to it. It's like a loose thread. The salt corrosion on those bits was worse than anything I'd seen outside of a salvage yard, and I'd worked a salvage contract in Burnaby for 8 months back in my late 20s, so I had a reference point. Those bits were holding on through habit more than anything else. I filed it away again. Someone else's problem. I kept walking. That's when I heard it. Not loud. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about that night. None of it was loud. It was this low, rhythmic thrumming, almost below the range where you'd call it a sound, more like a pressure. I felt it in my sternum before I actually heard it with my ears. And I stopped walking and stood still and tried to figure out which direction it was coming from. East. deeper into the container rows, away from the water. I went toward it, because that's what you do when you're the only person on a terminal at midnight and something is making a sound it shouldn't be making. You go toward it. I'm not saying that was brave. It was just the only logical option. And also, I figured it was probably a mechanical issue with one of the refrigerated containers. Reefer units make weird noises. I'd worked near enough of them to know that. It wasn't a reefer unit. I found it about 6 rows in, a rusted blue container sitting on its own on a section of concrete that was mostly empty. The containers around it had left gaps, like they'd been moved away from it at some point and nobody had filled the space back in. The blue was a faded industrial blue, the kind that's been sun-bleached and salt-blasted until it's more of a suggestion of color than an actual color. There was rust along every seam. The tracking number on the side was wrong. I noticed that immediately. I've looked at enough shipping containers to know the format. ISO standard, 4 letters and 7 numbers, check digit at the end. This one had the right number of characters, but the letters weren't right. Not a real carrier prefix. Not anything I recognized, and I know most of them. I stood there for a second and looked at it and thought, that's a problem. And then I felt the vibration through the soles of my boots. The gravel around the base of the container was moving. Not a lot. Just scattering slightly, a slow drift outward from the steel, like the container was breathing. The thrumming was coming from inside it, and it wasn't mechanical. I know what mechanical sounds like. This was wet, rhythmic, a pulse basically, a massive, slow pulse, like something with a very large heart was sitting inside that container in the dark. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what it was. I went and got the fire hose. The hose station was 2 rows over, mounted to a standpipe on a concrete pillar. Industrial setup, the kind with a 2.5-inch coupling and a brass nozzle that takes both hands to manage when it's running full pressure. I got it uncoupled, dragged it back to the container, and opened the valve. The pressure was good. I soaked the whole container top to bottom, working the nozzle across the sides and letting the water pool around the base. The thrumming slowed down after about 2 minutes. Slowed, then went irregular, then stopped. The gravel settled. The pulse was gone. I held the hose on it for another minute anyway. Rule 1 didn't specify a duration, and I wasn't in a hurry. When I cut the water and let the runoff drain away, I saw the sludge. It was coming from the bottom seal, the rubber gasket along the lower edge of the container door. Thick and black, not quite liquid, moving the way cold tar moves when you tilt the container it's sitting in. There wasn't a lot of it, but there was enough to notice. It spread slowly across the wet concrete and sat there. I crouched down and looked at it. Didn't touch it. I've worked around enough industrial fluids to know you don't touch unknown substances without knowing what you're dealing with. But I leaned close enough to smell it. Rotting kelp. Old copper. Something underneath both of those that I don't have a word for. Something organic and cold that made the back of my throat tighten. Not petroleum, not hydraulic fluid. Not any solvent or lubricant or coolant I'd ever worked near, and I'd worked near most of them. Whatever was in that container, it wasn't cargo. I stood up. The vibration was gone. Rule 1 said, soak the container until the vibration stops, and the vibration had stopped. Rule followed, problem managed. The sludge sat on the concrete and didn't do anything. I coiled the hose back as far as it would go and headed for the security kiosk to check the monitors. It was a small building, basically a booth with a desk and a bank of screens showing feeds from cameras mounted around the terminal. Thermal on the left side, standard video on the right. I sat down in the chair and pulled up the thermal feeds first. I almost missed it. The STS crane is a big structure, shipped to shore, the kind with a gantry that extends out over the water when it's working. At rest, it just sits at the edge of the pier like a piece of industrial architecture, all steel lattice and cable. The gantry was maybe 40 meters up. On the thermal feed, the gantry should have been empty. It wasn't. There was a cluster of heat signatures moving along the upper rail, long and thin. The limbs, too many of them and too long, dragging something heavy and dense behind them. The mass in the middle was bright on the thermal, hotter than the surrounding structure, and it was moving slowly toward the crane's control cabin. I sat there for about 3 seconds. Then I got up and went to the spotlight. The industrial spotlight was mounted on a swivel post outside the kiosk, the kind of unit that puts out enough light to read by from 100 meters away. I swung it up toward the gantry and hit the switch and flooded the whole upper section with white light. The heat signatures were gone when I checked the thermal monitor again. Just gone. The gantry was empty. I stood at the monitor for a second, then looked at the ground level camera feed on the right side of the bank. The black sludge from the container was moving, not running, not fast, just crawling, the way it had spread across the concrete at the container, but with direction now. It was heading toward the pier, toward the water, and behind it, burned into the concrete in a dark trail, was a charred line where it had been. I watched it on the screen. 2 rules followed. 2 things addressed. The thrumming in the container was gone, and whatever had been on the gantry was gone. Both handled correctly, exactly by the card. The sludge kept moving. The sludge kept moving on the screen. I watched it for probably 2 minutes straight, which doesn't sound long but felt like a lot longer when you're standing alone in a terminal at midnight with a flare gun on your hip and no one to talk to about any of this. The ground level camera had decent resolution, enough that I could see the charred trail the sludge left behind it. This dark, scorched line across the concrete like someone had dragged a lit torch through the yard. The sludge itself was slow, patient, almost. It knew where it was going. I checked the clock on the monitor bank. 1:58. 2 minutes to the window. Rule 2 was the one that had stuck with me the most when I'd first read the card. The others had a logic to them, even if the logic was bent sideways. Vibrating container, use the hose. Heat signature on the gantry, use the spotlight. Those were cause and response. I understood cause and response. I'd spent 12 years in fabrication shops where the wrong call on a weld joint could take a finger or worse, and you learned fast to read a situation and match the tool to the problem. But Rule 2 was different. Rule 2 was just don't look. No response required, just don't look at the water's edge between 2 and 4, regardless of what sounds come from the pier. The regardless was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I'd noticed that when I read it the first time. The clock ticked to 2. I pulled my eyes off the ground level feed and looked at the full monitor bank instead. 7 cameras total. 4 covering the container rows, 1 on the gatehouse, 1 on the crane base, 1 on the pier approach. Nothing was moving except the sludge on camera 6. I kept my back to the window. At 2:15, the temperature dropped. Not gradually. Just dropped. The way it does when someone opens a walk-in freezer door, that immediate wall of cold hitting you in the face. I was wearing my canvas jacket, and I felt it go through the jacket. My forearms went tight. The burn scars there doing that thing they do in the cold where they pull a little, remind me they're there. I didn't move. Then the chains started. Heavy iron chains, the kind you use to secure container loads or moor a vessel to a bit. I know that sound. I've worked around docks enough to know exactly what a mooring chain sounds like when it's under tension. That low, grinding scrape of iron links dragging across iron or concrete. This was that sound, but bigger, deeper. Coming from the pier side of the terminal, which was behind me and to the left, and I did not turn around. I stood at the monitor bank and I watched the screens. Camera 5 showed the gatehouse. The gatehouse door opened. Jaden walked out. He was still in his supervisor's uniform, that loose-hanging thing that never quite fit him right. He walked across the frame at a steady pace. No hurry. He crossed the gatehouse camera's field of view and disappeared off the right edge of the frame, which put him heading toward the pier. I switched my attention to the pier approach camera. Camera 7. caught him walking into frame from the left. He walked the length of the pier approach without slowing down, without looking at anything, without doing anything that looked like a man who had any concerns about where he was going. He reached the pier edge. He stepped off. I watched his heat signature on the thermal monitor. It didn't drop. He didn't fall. The signature just kept moving, upward and outward, at a steady climbing angle like he'd stepped onto a ramp. A long, invisible ramp leading out over the harbor at maybe a 15-degree incline. His heat signature was small on the thermal display, this little orange shape against the cold dark of the water, and it just kept climbing. Steady pace. Same pace he'd walked the pier, like this was a route he knew. I stood there and watched that for a while. I'm not sure exactly how long. The clock said 2:22 when I finally looked away from the thermal feed, so maybe 7 minutes. That felt about right. 7 minutes of watching Jaden Olson walk upward into nothing above the Burrard Inlet. There were two things I understood by the time his heat signature had climbed high enough that the thermal display's range couldn't track it anymore. First, Jaden wasn't a supervisor. Not really. Whatever his actual job was, it was closer to greeter or handler. He'd met whatever came to this terminal at night, kept things organized on the ground, and when the time came, he went with it. Facilitator was the word that came to mind, and I couldn't think of a better one. Second, the rules weren't just safety protocols. I'd followed 2 of them correctly tonight, done exactly what the card said, handled both situations without panicking or improvising. And Jaden had watched me do it from inside the gatehouse. That was the test. That was what the whole night was. Someone checking whether I was observant enough, controlled enough, useful enough. And now Jaden was gone, and whatever he'd been facilitating for had just demonstrated that it could pull a man off a pier and walk him up into the sky, and I was the only person left in this terminal. That part bugged me a little. I pulled up the tide schedule on the kiosk's secondary screen. The Port Authority keeps tide data on a rolling display for the crane operators, updated every 15 minutes. I found the peak high tide marker, 3:42. Same time Rule 4 required the pier cleared of debris. I'd always figured that was a coincidence, the kind of operational overlap you get when multiple systems are running in the same space. It wasn't a coincidence. The pier had to be clear at 3:42 because something needed the pier clear at 3:42. Something that arrived with the tide. The chains were still going outside. Louder now. Or maybe I was just more aware of them. I looked at the clock. 2:29. I looked at the monitors. The sludge on camera 6 had reached the edge of the camera's frame and was gone from view, heading for the water. The crane base camera showed nothing. The gatehouse camera showed an empty pier approach and an open gatehouse door swinging slightly in whatever wind was moving off the inlet. I stood there for probably 90 seconds, which is longer than it sounds when you're working something out. The rules were a test. I'd passed the test. Jaden had left. Something enormous was anchored out in that harbor right now, and in 73 minutes it was going to have a high tide and a clear pier, and whatever the sludge was crawling toward it for a reason. The rules had been enough to manage the night up until now. They weren't going to be enough for what was coming. I knew that the same way I know when a weld is wrong before I've even run a bead on it. Some combination of everything I'm looking at adding up to a number I don't like. Rule 2 said don't look at the water's edge between 2 and 4. I turned around and looked at the water's edge. The fog was thick, the kind of fog that sits on the inlet in January and makes the whole harbor feel like it's been sealed off from the rest of the world. Through it, about 200 meters out, something was moving. Not moving toward me exactly, more like materializing, coming into focus the way a shape does when your eyes adjust to dark. Except this was the opposite. The fog thinning around it as the water rose and pushed it closer. It was a ship. Old, 1940s maybe, based on the hull profile and the superstructure silhouette. Merchant Marine. The kind of vessel that spent the war carrying cargo across the North Atlantic and then spent the next 40 years being sold down the chain until it ended up running routes nobody else wanted. The hull was rusted through in patches, barnacled from the waterline up, and it was covered in the same black sludge that had leaked from the container and crawled across my concrete, dripping with it. The sludge ran down the hull in long, slow rivulets and dropped into the water where it spread outward in a dark slick. The ship's displacement was doing something to the water. As it moved closer, the harbor level was rising faster than the tide alone could account for, a surge building up ahead of the hull and spreading across the pier in a thin sheet of dark water. I felt it before I saw it, the sound of water hitting concrete, and then the camera feeds confirmed it. Camera 7 showing the pier approach going wet. It was trying to dock. I stood at the terminal's edge and watched it come through the fog. And I thought about corroded mooring bits. And I thought about a flare gun on my hip rated for magnesium rounds. And I thought about a 40-foot crane with an emergency release I'd walked past twice tonight. The ship kept coming. I ran. That's the honest version. No plan, no checklist, just the image of that ship coming through the fog and my legs already moving before I'd finished the thought. Rule 3 said spotlight, not ladder. I knew that. I'd read the card twice and memorized it, and I still ran straight for the base of the STS crane and grabbed the first rung of the access ladder with both hands. I figured the rules covered a normal night. Whatever this was, it wasn't that anymore. The crane was one of those old ship-to-shore rigs, the kind with the A-frame legs and the long horizontal boom extending out over the water. The control cabin sat maybe 60 feet up, a boxy steel room bolted to the frame just below the trolley track. I'd walked past it twice tonight and clocked the layout the way I always do with heavy equipment. Automatically, without meaning to. Old habit from the yards. You look at a machine and you just know where the load controls are, where the emergency systems sit, where the weak points are. The crane had an emergency release on the main hoist, a big red lever, the kind that requires 2 hands and some commitment. I started climbing. The rungs were cold and slick with salt moisture, and I kept my eyes up, not down. Thermal signatures, the card had said, flickering in the shadows. I'd seen one on the monitor earlier and hit it with the spotlight, and it had gone away, or at least gone somewhere I couldn't see. I thought about that on the way up. Went somewhere I couldn't see was doing a lot of work as a comfort. About 30 feet up, I made the mistake of looking down. The black sludge was pooling at the base of the crane, not a little. It had spread in a rough circle maybe 10 feet across, sitting thick and dark on the concrete, and it was still moving, still spreading outward from the center the way spilled paint moves, but slower and wrong. It had come from the container, crawled across the pier, and now it had found the crane's footings and stopped there, waiting maybe. I don't know. I kept climbing. The control cabin door was unlocked, which I was grateful for because I hadn't thought about that until I was already at the top and my hands were tired. I got inside and pulled the door shut behind me. The cabin smelled like machine oil and old cigarettes and a little bit of mildew. There was a cracked vinyl seat in front of the main console, a bank of monitors showing the crane's load sensors, and a narrow window looking out over the terminal and the harbor beyond it. I looked out the window. The ship was still there. It had moved closer. The fog was thinner now, or the ship was generating its own light, some dull phosphorescent glow that came off the sludge coating its hull. It was sitting in the harbor at a slight angle, bow pointed toward the pier, and it wasn't moving the way a ship moves in water. It was too still. The water was moving around it, but the ship itself was just there, fixed, like it had been bolted to the harbor floor, the invisible gangplank. That's what I kept thinking about. Jaden had walked off the pier and gone up, and whatever he'd walked up was still there, connecting the terminal to that ship. I couldn't see it, but the sludge at the base of the crane was sitting directly in line with where Jaden had stepped off, and I figured that was probably not a coincidence. I had the flare gun on my hip, heavy, loaded, 1 round, rated for magnesium. Rule 5 said the flare gun was for a total breach only. Signal the Coast Guard. Don't use it for light. Don't waste it. I looked at the sludge pooled below me. I looked at the ship. I looked at the charred trail the sludge had burned into the concrete on its way across the pier, a black line leading right to where I was standing. Total breach. Yeah. I was comfortable calling it that. I opened the cabin window, which required some effort because it had clearly never been opened by anyone who actually needed it open in a hurry, and I leaned out and aimed the flare gun at the sludge trail on the concrete below. The angle was bad. I had to lean further than I wanted to, 60 feet up, one hand on the window frame, and I thought briefly about what a stupid way this would be to die, and then I pulled the trigger. The flare hit the concrete about 4 feet short of the sludge pool, and I thought I'd missed. And then the magnesium caught the edge of the trail and the whole thing went up. It wasn't like a normal fire. Normal fire is orange, and it moves with the air. This was white, almost blue-white, and it moved against the air, spreading along the sludge trail in both directions simultaneously, following the charred path back across the pier in a solid wall of light. The heat came up through the open window and hit me in the face. I pulled back and squinted against it. Below, the sludge pool at the crane's base was burning. The wall of fire cut straight across the pier, right through the line between the terminal and the water, and I heard something. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure change, like the air in the cabin shifted all at once. Something had been severed. I don't know how else to say it. Something that had been connected wasn't anymore. Out on the harbor, the ship lurched, just slightly. A small movement, like a boat that's had its mooring line cut. It drifted maybe 10 feet to the left and then corrected, or tried to. But it was less solid than it had been. The edges of it were harder to look at, like my eyes kept sliding off the hull. I didn't have time to watch it. I turned to the crane controls. The main console was old, older than I expected, with physical levers and load indicators and a dial for the trolley position. It was all labeled in both English and what I think was Cantonese, which made sense given the terminal's history, and most of the labels were worn down to suggestions. But I'd operated similar rigs during a contract job in North Van about 6 years back, and the layout was close enough. Hoist control on the left, trolley traverse in the middle, emergency release behind a hinged yellow cover on the far right. I found the load on the trolley, a 40-foot container, already rigged from the previous shift, sitting in the staging area about 30 meters back from the pier's edge. I got the trolley moving and watched through the window as the container began tracking outward along the boom, swinging slightly in the wind off the water. The crane groaned. Everything groaned. I kept the speed low because a swinging 40-foot container is its own problem, and I needed it to land in a specific place. The mooring bits, that's what I'd clocked on the first perimeter walk, the corroded ones where the pier met the harbor floor. I'd looked at those welds the way I always look at bad welds, with the particular mild disgust of someone who knows what good ones look like. The salt air had eaten them down to maybe 30% of rated capacity, maybe less. They were holding the pier together the way a Band-Aid holds a cracked board. If something hit them hard enough, directly enough, the concrete above would shatter and the iron below would fold. I got the container positioned. It was hanging directly above the bits, swinging in a slow arc, and I waited for the arc to center, and then I flipped the cover off the emergency release and pulled the lever. The hoist disengaged. The container dropped. 60 feet, 40 tons of loaded steel straight down. The impact came up through the crane's legs and into the cabin floor and into my boots and into my teeth. A sound like a building falling. I grabbed the console with both hands and watched through the window as the concrete at the pier's edge buckled outward and the mooring bits folded inward, and a section of the pier about 20 feet wide just ceased to be a pier and became a pile of concrete and iron in the water below. The harbor churned where it hit. The ship made a sound. I don't have a better word for it than that. It made a sound, low and long and wrong. The kind of sound that you feel in your back molars more than you hear with your ears. And then it started moving backward, not turning, not steering, just retreating, sliding backward into the fog the way it had come, and as it went, the edges of it got softer, and the glow off the sludge on its hull dimmed, and by the time the water level had dropped even 6 inches with the receding tide, the ship was half gone, and by the time another minute had passed, it was nothing, just fog and dark water, and the sound of the harbor settling back into itself. I stood in the control cabin with both hands still on the console. The fire on the pier was dying down. The concrete where the bits had been was just a gap now, open to the water. The sludge trail was mostly burned off. The camera feeds I could see from up here showed an empty terminal, no movement, nothing on the gantry. I let go of the console. My hands were shaking a little, which I noticed the same way I'd notice a loose bolt. Registered, filed, not particularly surprising given the circumstances. The harbor was quiet. I didn't hear the cable go. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I felt it. This massive concussive shudder that came up through the floor of the control cabin, through the soles of my boots, up into my legs. But the actual snap of the cable was lost somewhere in the noise of the container hitting the pier. 1 second I was standing at the console watching the ship start to lose its shape in the fog. The next second the floor was coming up at me and there was a white-hot line of nothing where my left foot used to be. I went down hard. My shoulder caught the edge of the console on the way and I ended up against the back wall of the cabin, which was maybe 4 feet from the console, so that tells you how small the space was. The pain wasn't pain yet, not exactly. It was more like pressure and heat and a kind of ringing absence, the way a weld joint feels right after you've run the bead, before it cools enough to tell you what it's actually done. I looked down because I had to. You always look. The cable had come through the lower section of the cabin window. There was a clean diagonal gap in the glass that hadn't been there before. And below my left knee, past where my boot should have been, there was just the floor. My foot was about 2 feet to my left, still inside the boot. I registered that, filed it. Didn't spend a lot of time on it. My belt was already in my hands before I'd consciously decided to reach for it. I don't know if that's training or just the part of your brain that runs on its own when the thinking part gets overloaded. I got the belt off, looped it above the ankle, above where the cable had gone through, and I pulled it tight. The buckle bit into my palm. I pulled it tighter. I threaded the tongue through the keeper loop and held it, both hands, leaning my weight into the wall behind me so I had something to brace against. That was the first 30 seconds, roughly. I'm guessing on the time. I wasn't watching the clock. After that, I just held the position. That was the whole job for a while. Hold the belt. Don't let the tension go. Keep breathing at a rate that doesn't make things worse. I'm not going to say it didn't hurt, because it absolutely did, but there's a version of pain that you can put in a box and set on a shelf and just not look at directly, and that's what I did. I've had burns before. Not like this, but the principle is the same. You acknowledge it's there, you don't argue with it, you don't give it your full attention, and you focus on the next practical thing. The next practical thing was the cabin glass in front of me. Through what was left of it, I could see the harbor. The fire on the pier was mostly out. Just a few orange patches where the sludge had pooled in the low spots of the concrete and was still burning down to nothing. The gap where the mooring bits had been was dark and open, concrete rubble at the edges, water showing through below. The container I'd dropped was down there somewhere in the mess, mostly hidden by the angle. I couldn't see it from where I was sitting. The ship was gone. That much was clear. There was fog, and there was dark water, and there was the normal ambient light of the harbor at whatever hour it was. I still wasn't watching the clock. And there was nothing else. No hull, no sludge glow, no sound of chains or the low-frequency thrumming that had started the whole night off. The water was just water again, settling back into the regular chop of the inlet. I thought about Jaden. Not for long, but I thought about him. his heat signature rising off the pier, climbing something I couldn't see, going up and up until the feed had lost him. I didn't know if that was a thing he'd chosen or a thing that had happened to him, or some version of both that doesn't translate into terms I had the right vocabulary for. I figured it was probably the last one. I also figured I wasn't going to get an answer, and that was fine. I had other things to manage. The gantry cameras, the ones I could see the feeds from on the console above me. I couldn't reach them from the floor, but I'd had a clear look before I went down, and the gantry had been empty. No heat signatures, no movement. Whatever had been up there earlier in the night had gone with the ship or gone somewhere else, and either way, it wasn't my problem anymore. The sludge trail on the ground-level concrete had stopped moving. I'd watched it crawl toward the water for most of the night, slow and deliberate, and now it was just a burned-in stain on the pier surface, charred and still. The fire hose had handled the first container. The spotlight had handled the gantry. The flare had handled the gangplank. The container drop had handled the ship. I'd used everything on the card, every rule, every tool, every resource I'd been handed at the start of the shift. I'd also used my belt and my own structural knowledge and the corroded mooring bits I'd noticed on the first walk, which weren't on the card at all. So I'd used everything plus a little extra, and it had been exactly enough. And the cost of exactly enough was currently sitting in a boot 2 feet to my left. That math didn't bother me as much as I'd expected it to. I was still here. The terminal was still here. The ship was gone. What bothered me a little was the ladder. Specifically the fact that I was 60-something feet up in a crane control cabin with 1 foot and a belt tourniquet and no way to get down on my own. The ladder ran down the exterior of the crane's mast, steel rungs bolted into the frame, and even on a good day with 2 working feet and both hands free, it was a deliberate climb. I looked at it through the cabin door, which was hanging open about 4 inches because the frame had torqued slightly when the cable snapped. I looked at it for a while. Then I stopped looking at it because there was nothing to decide. I wasn't climbing down. That was just a fact. So I waited. I kept the belt tight. I found a position against the back wall that put the least amount of pressure on the wound, and I held it. The pain was doing what pain does when you're stuck with it. It was trying to get my full attention, pushing at the edges of the box I'd put it in, and I kept not giving it what it wanted. I focused on the console. On the camera feeds I could partially see from the floor. On the sound of the harbor. On the fact that the harbor sounded normal. Just wind and water and the distant mechanical noise of the port's outer sections. The parts that ran on their own schedule regardless of what happened in here. At some point the sky outside the cabin, glass started going lighter. Not light, not yet. Just less dark. That particular gray that comes in before the actual color does. When you can start to make out shapes, but everything's still the same flat tone. I'd worked enough early morning shifts in my life to know that gray. It meant the night was done. I didn't try to call out. There was nobody to call to. The gatehouse was empty. The terminal was empty. Whoever came in with the morning would find the crane first or find the pier first, and either way they'd find me eventually. I just had to stay where I was and keep the belt tight and not do anything stupid. The sky kept getting lighter, slow the way it always is when you're waiting on it. I kept my eyes on the camera feeds and my hands on the belt, and I waited for morning to finish arriving. The morning crew found me around 6:15. I heard them before I saw them. Voices below, somebody calling out, the kind of flat shouting you do when you're not sure if anyone's listening. I managed to get a hand on the cabin glass and knock twice. Took a minute, but eventually one of them looked up. 3 guys. Orange vests, hard hats, thermoses. Standard morning shift. They stood at the base of the crane looking up at me for a second, and I could see them trying to figure out what they were looking at. A guy in a shot-up control cabin with a belt around his leg and no obvious explanation for any of it. One of them pulled out a radio. I figured he was calling for an ambulance. That's what you do. That's the obvious thing. He wasn't calling for an ambulance. I found that out about 20 minutes later when a dark blue SUV with no markings pulled up to the base of the crane, and two guys got out who were very clearly not paramedics. They moved like they'd done this kind of thing before. Calm. Efficient. Not looking around the way normal people look around when they walk into a scene like that. No curiosity, just purpose. Getting me down from that cabin was not a clean process. I'll leave it at that. They had a harness rig and they knew how to use it. And at some point I was on the ground and then I was in the back of the SUV and the door was closed. The third man was already in the vehicle. He was sitting in the front passenger seat and he turned around to look at me once, just briefly, the way you check that a piece of cargo is secured before you drive. Stocky guy, square jaw, dark hair going gray at the temples, maybe 45. He had the kind of face that didn't tell you anything.
"Parker Wang,"
he said.
"Port Authority."
I didn't say anything. I was a little busy. He turned back around. We drove. The medical facility was private. I don't know exactly where it was. I wasn't in great shape for navigation by that point. But it wasn't a hospital. No emergency department. No waiting room. No other patients that I ever saw. Clean, quiet. Smelled like antiseptic and new carpet. Somebody met us at a side entrance with a gurney, and that was the last I saw of Parker Wang for a while. I was in and out for most of what came next. Surgery, I think, at some point. Definitely a lot of time on a ceiling that was a slightly different shade of white than the walls. I remember being cold and then being warm and then being cold again. The pain was always there, but it changed character depending on what they'd given me. Sometimes it was sharp and close, and sometimes it was far away and dull, like something happening in another room. At some point, a woman came in and checked things and wrote things down and didn't answer any of my questions, which at that point were mostly just, where am I and can I call someone? I didn't have anyone specific to call. I just wanted to know if I could. I couldn't, apparently, or at least not yet. I slept a lot. Parker Wang came back when I was more coherent. Maybe 3 days in, maybe 4. He pulled up a chair next to the bed and set a folder on the side table and folded his hands on top of it.
"How are you feeling?"
he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Okay," I said. He nodded. He had a way of nodding that meant he'd already moved past whatever you'd just said. He explained the situation in the same tone someone uses to explain a parking validation process. The Port Authority had covered my medical costs in full. The prosthetic fitting would be handled through a specialist they had a relationship with. My outstanding debt, and here he said an amount that was close enough to what I actually owed that I understood they'd done some homework, had been cleared through a third party as of 2 days ago. I watched him say all of this. He wasn't reading from the folder. He had it memorized. "That's a lot," I said.
"It is,"
he said.
"What do you want for it?"
He opened the folder then, slid it across to me. It was about 12 pages, single-spaced, and the language in it was the kind of legal language that's specifically designed to be hard to read when you're tired and medicated and your left foot is gone. I'm not great at reading legal documents under the best circumstances. That's me. I know what I know, and contract language isn't it. I read enough to get the shape of it. Non-disclosure. No discussion of events at the Centrum terminal on that specific date. No contact with media, regulatory bodies, or maritime unions regarding anything observed during the shift. Standard-looking stuff at first, but then further in, it got more specific. Maritime union membership, suspended pending review. Port access credentials, revoked. And then a clause that covered every port in British Columbia, which meant it covered every port that mattered if you worked the coast. I set the folder down. Parker Wang was watching me with those flat brown eyes. "This takes my union card," I said.
"Technically it suspends it."
"For how long?" He didn't answer that. I looked at the folder again. 12 pages for a career. That was it. That was the whole trade. Cleared debt, covered bills, a prosthetic foot, and no way to work the industry that had been the only consistent thing in my adult life. I thought about the night. I thought about the mooring bits and how I'd noticed them on the first walk. Just logged them as a structural problem the way I always log structural problems. The same reflex I'd built over 10 years of welding work. I thought about how that one habit, that one thing I couldn't turn off, had ended up being the thing that stopped the ship. And then I thought about how it had also made me the guy who knew too much to be left alone with a union card and a working career on the docks. That part bugged me a little. Parker Wang handed me a pen. It was a plain black Bic, the kind you find in a cup on a bank counter. I signed it. The prosthetic fitting happened 6 weeks later at a clinic in Burnaby. The specialist was thorough and didn't make it weird, which I appreciated. The fitting took most of a morning, and there were adjustments over the following weeks, and eventually I could walk without thinking about it too much, which I'd been told was the goal. I got around fine. Still do. The debt being gone was strange. I'd been carrying it long enough that not having it felt like missing a tooth. You keep probing the space where it was. The Richmond guys never reached out. Whatever Parker Wang's third party had done, it had held. I didn't go back to the port. Not Centerm, not any of them. The blacklist was real. I checked quietly through a guy I knew who still had his card. My name was on a document he couldn't tell me much about except that it existed and that it covered the whole coast. So that was settled. I picked up welding work inland after that. Construction sites, mostly. Some pipeline maintenance. It's not the same money and it's not the same work. But the reflex is still there. I still notice the bad welds, the compromised joints, the places where metal has been asked to do more than it's rated for. You don't turn that off. I thought about the ship a lot in those first months. The way it had materialized out of the fog, barnacled and dripping, moving toward the pier like it had done this before and expected it to work. The way it had started losing density when the mooring points went. The way it had just slid back into the water and disappeared. It was still out there. I was certain of that, the way I'm certain about structural things. Not because I can prove it, but because I understand how load-bearing systems work. And that ship had been doing this long enough to have a process. A facilitator waiting at the gatehouse. Rules designed to manage the approach without stopping it. A test built into the shift to sort the guards worth taking from the ones who just disappear quietly. Jaden Olsen was gone. I never found out anything more about him than I already knew. The terminal kept running. I checked the port schedules a few times early on, the way you picket something. Centrum was operational. Normal cargo volumes, normal shift rotations. Whatever had happened that night, the Port Authority had smoothed it over completely. That was probably the point of Parker Wang. That was probably all he did. Just smoothed things over. One private facility and one 12-page document at a time. Somewhere out in the Burrard Inlet, or further out past the harbor mouth, or wherever it went when the tide dropped, the ship was waiting. Patient the way old things are patient. Waiting for the next high tide and a guard who'd read the card twice, memorize the rules, and follow every single one of them all the way to 3:42 a.m. without ever once thinking to look at the welds. I hoped they got someone careful. I hoped, more than that, they got someone who couldn't help noticing things.